In this lecture, would like to discuss about functional representation. So, exactly, functional representation means the system of territorial or geographical representation which is based on the assumption that people residing in the same area share common interest. The advocates of functional representation have contested this thesis and point out that not territorial communities but interest can be represented. Their contention is that representation should be functional. Individuals can be more accurately represented on the basis of occupational or economic interest. Usually, it is argued in constituency comprises diverse economic groups such as farmers, tradesmen, employers, industrial workers, etc. Hence, it is not possible for one representative to represent all the points of view of the constituents. Still, such representatives do, in fact, take part in the enactment of laws affecting these diverse interests. It is sure to lead to the making of ineffective laws that have little or no relevance to the choice of effective means. The ridiculous effect of such legislation is well borne out by the story of a steamship company that found itself compelled to carry two sets of lifeboats, one set to satisfy rigid governmental specifications and the other to save the lives of its passengers in the narrow choppy seas in which the company operated. The advocates of functional representation find in it a remedy against these defects of territorial representation. Their scheme is to treat every important specialized interest or function as a unit for representation. The legislature would thus be composed of the representatives of organized interest and not of the people residing in particular geographical areas. There have always been advocates of the system of functional representation. At the time of the French Revolution, it was supported by the French revolutionary activist Mirabeau. Later, eminent writers have proposed different schemes for the representation of interest or functions. As for instance, Professor Duguid urged all the great forces of the national life ought to be represented: industry, property, commerce, manufacturing, professions, and even science and religion. The Guild Socialists in Britain had developed the principle of occupational representation in great detail. Strangely enough, functional representation has been experimented with by dictators and not democrats. In Mussolini's fascist rule, the corporative state in Italy, a non representative fascist or corporative chamber, was developed on the basis of economic grouping to facilitate the working of a highly regimented economic system. The Nazi Germany's under Hitler organized a system of states representative of economic interest. The very critics of this functional representation, such as the most serious criticism against this system, is that it seeks to bolster up the claims of particular interest at the expense of the general national interest. So, to quote Professor Hedalowski, vocational bodies have value for the resolution of functional problems, but they are not by their very nature built to deal with the general issues which must be faced by society as a whole, as he wrote in his work, A Grammar of Politics. Anxious care is taken under a scheme of functional representation to make provisions for the representation of various economic and occupational groups, but there is no room for a unified central authority epitomizing the conception of the national interest. So, as Professor Corey remarks, function becomes so important that it obscures the individuals. Also, too much preoccupation with the clear articulation and vindication of function weakens the sense of community, of belonging to something that contains but transcends the function. So the very deputies do not belong to the nation or even to the individual voters in the constituency, but only to their separate functions. So, the second criticism against functional representation is that if representation is based on particular function, there would be as many parties as there are functions. Consequently, the present party system, which seeks to patch up group interest and through of a unified conception of general interest, would cease to function under a system of functional representation. And the third argument labeled by the critics as such system of representation operating through the mechanism of a multiplicity of functional organizations would automatically lead to the same governmental paralysis as take place under the system of proportional representation. And the fourth most important argument against functional representation is laid down by Professor Hedalowski, who points out that it is possible to construct a representative body which will fairly contain the needs of any given class of producers. But the problem here is the very different one of weighting functions one against the other in order to secure a just numerical relationship. It seems very doubtful whether this can be done. So, it can be remarked by way of conclusion that democracy lives by the organization of centripetal rather than centrifugal forces. Since functional representation seeks to release the disruptive forces in a community, it is inimical to the spirit of democracy. Still, it is generally believed that various interests crowding a modern society need to be represented in some way. Nowadays, instead of making provisions for the representation of various interests in the legislature, arrangements are much for their representation and advisory committees attached to a particular government department that deal with the administration of laws affecting some functional groups. Also, participation of organized interest in government is sometimes facilitated by their representation in the administration itself. This happens when a broad board consisting of the representatives of employers and employees is set up to decide, for example, say minimum wages. So, this is all about functional representation and how functional representation is a blow to a strong democracy as it was presented by Professor Lasky and Professor Corey. So, these are the arguments against functional representation. In spite of these arguments, we found certain strong advocates of functional representation, and those advocates of functional representation, as we found among them the great French revolutionary Mirabeau and Professor Duguid Cholso. It's working in the Mussolini's Italy's corporative state, and also why the Nazi Germany under Hitler by the organized system of state representative of economic interest. Even we found the functional representation in the Salzarism in Portugal. So, this is all about functional representation, and in our next upcoming video, we would like to discuss minority representation, and in minority representation, we found three different voting systems, such as the first one, cumulative vote system, limited vote system, and communal representation, and that we would like to discuss in our upcoming